It's Martin Luther King Day. What is it, January 16th, 2023? I have with me on our Teachers Fight Back podcast Gavin Aronsen, who has agreed to sit with me for an interview. I'm very grateful. Good morning, Gavin.
Morning.
He is a journalist, Gavin, Aronsen, who has reported on Republican efforts to silence teachers and ban books in several Iowa communities, including Johnston, Ankeny, Urbandale, Ames, and Denison. He's the founder of the online publication, the Iowa Informer, and he's also reported for the Ames Tribune and worked for the Village Voice and Mother Jones. So he brings a strong and interesting background to this conversation. Um, Gavin, in your reporting, you've focused on the actions of Republican legislators to an extent, such as Brad Zahn and Jake Chapman, who have sought to control what teachers and students can think about and discuss in the classroom. What have they been doing at school boards, and why are they doing it?
Well, specifically, Brad Zahn and Jake Chapman specifically, I covered them last year. I got the article up here. This is December 2021, I guess, the end of a couple years ago. It kind of, I was focused a lot, particularly when Trump became president. So going back a few years, just the influx of conspiratorial thinking and how that increasingly influenced the mainstream Republican Party in terms of its policies and the types of candidates that were getting elected. And so that had been more of my focus. But Brad Zahn and Jake Chapman were going to school board meetings. I focused on a couple in Johnston, but I believe they went to some other ones, and there's some other legislators too, like Eddie Andrews, who is a state lawmaker who represents Johnston. And they were going to these meetings as part of their kind of the groomer moral panic and this idea that teachers and librarians in the schools were disseminating pornography to students, which is entirely false. And the aim, as many people are probably well aware, is targeting books that are from a LGBTQ perspective. One I mentioned in here is the Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, which is about someone's experience growing up on a reservation, a Native American. There's other books that talk about race relations, and The Hate You Give is another one I mentioned in this piece that I'm looking at here about Brad Zahn and Jake Chapman. That was about the Oscar Grant shooting. So police interactions with Black Americans. So really, it's an effort to limit what is taught in schools under the guise of trying to protect children, but it's really, they're trying to censor ideas that are not beneficial toward the Republican Party and that they don't want, young Iowans being exposed to in public schools.
Right. This comes under this legislation, House File 802, in which they don't want divisive concepts to be part of the conversation, nor have the word systemic racism be employed K through college settings. Um,
Mm.
why do you think they're doing this? I mean, why do they want to silence these conversations? What's the politics involved in your estimation?
Well, part of it, is just these are not ideas that are uh, they're ideologically opposed to these ideas. Also, I think a lot of it is just opportunism because with that bill specifically, which I'm not sure which version of it became law a year or two ago, but um, the idea, it was a pretty convenient way. I think a lot of this all really goes into what Republicans are doing now with the school privatization efforts, and it's all part of a broader kind of umbrella plan to demonize public education. I think is where all of this ultimately is headed. So I think it's all part and parcel of that. But that also was that was a convenient way to kind of do that because of the Black Lives Matter movement and just attaching this to unpopular things that pull in an unpopular way in Iowa, like some of the protests, just the Iowans' views on police. Um, there were a lot of efforts to kind of a lot of misinformation and efforts to propagandize what was happening with those movements, and this idea that there's cities that are burning to the ground because of Antifa activists, and it's all very misleading. But it's this idea that we're kind of descending into lawlessness, and Democrats are on board with this, and all this kind of stuff is just a convenient, reductive way to look at these issues and tie that in back into the school choice you know initiatives they're pushing for right now.
So it's all part of a kind of package of efforts to undermine public education, as well as to limit or control the kinds of discussions that can possibly take place within either public schools or private schools, should they be organized. Right? Is that what you're
That's
saying?
certainly the way I see it, and you can tell by for all that Republicans in Iowa have talked about Democrats' connections to out of state interests. For example, like Cindy Axne being like a Pelosi Democrat, or that like to do a lot of those things. They're doing the same kind of stuff themselves with, or I mean, that's maybe not a distortion of the truth there, but they for the divisive concepts thing you're talking about. If you look at what people like Christopher Rufo are doing, these people, he was in Virginia, I believe, a conservative think tank. He has really pushed the critical race theory idea that it's um, really driving all this school curriculum, which of course is not actually the case. It's a higher level college, kind of like law and theory kind of concept. That's and also the meaning of it has been completely just distorted beyond any sort of ability to discuss it constructively. Um, Another guy, Corey DeAngelis, with the who's he with? He was recently at the governor's ball the other day, and people like Jeff Shipley, who you'd mentioned to me the other day, were posing for photos with him.
Another
Um,
legislator.
yeah, he has a he's on the he's a fellow with the American Federation for Children, I think is what they call it. And there's a political action committee that put tens of thousands of dollars into several campaigns that were primarying Republicans who opposed the voucher uh, program proposal last year that didn't make it through the state house. Um, and several of those, I think 6 or 7 of them, those Republicans who opposed it were defeated. Maybe I'm straying from your question, but
No, no,
um,
I don't think so. It's all part of this fabric of how things are working within schools and the influence. Jeff Shipley, you mentioned, he was very involved in uh, going after a teacher in Fairfield, Iowa, in order to who had to leave the system because of the pressure that was put upon him. So these legislatures are going after individual teachers in some cases.
yeah, and uh, I forgot about that, but yeah, there is another teacher, I think maybe in the Johnson School District, who resigned because of
Yeah,
all these
Neil Patel.
politics.
Neil
Yeah,
Patel. Hmm.
yeah, and there's a you mentioned Ankeny earlier, so I'm from Ankeny, and I was briefly back there actually. I think when I wrote that article, the Brad Zahn and Jake Chapman, um, uh, and then it's like end of 2021, kind of beginning of 2022. Before I moved, I'm in Urbandale now. I moved to an apartment here, but before that, I was going to some of the school board meetings with the Ankeny Mama Bears, they call themselves, Kimberly
Yes.
Reeks and Emily Peterson, I think. And then they also often teamed up with this guy Stacy Pierce, who is he was involved in he has some construction business or something along those lines, and he has a house um, in Ankeny where he's flying straight up QAnon flags like Trump JFK Jr. 2024 and things like that. If you're familiar with that conspiracy that JFK Jr. is never dead and he's actually going to come back and help Trump take the White House. So these people are coming into all these school board meetings and just raising hell and just causing all kinds of a commotion. And, um, across the country, that's another thing I like to stress is that this is not unique to Iowa. It's something that is, of course, happening around the country and also here, unfortunately. And just the amount of time that this kind of crap takes away from school board members, from teachers, they have to deal with this with the legislation, even though a lot of it's performative, probably, or in search of or it's ultimately meant to contribute to, like I said, broader policy aims. It just really, it's a huge distraction. It's an unnecessary. It's sadly not unnecessary. They have to do something, like respond to it, but it takes away from their ability to actually, in the school board level, focus on policies that are going to help the school district, help the children and the teachers in the school district and administrators and everyone else. And then with the teachers, they have to worry about, are they going to get, sued? Or are they going to, be at risk of getting fired or anything if they step afoul of these issues, many of which seem to be, violations of, like the First Amendment. But a lot of it's not been gone through the courts. So it's just, all of it's a huge time suck. And, they're already off most of the time, underpaid, overworked. And now dealing with this, it's all, you can see where all this leads to undermining public education. The governor likes to talk about and other politicians like to talk about our failing public schools, which I don't think they've ever actually brought forth any data to show what metrics they're looking at, probably because they're not. But it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because if you're not funding schools adequately, if you're doing all this other stuff to distract administrators, teachers, others in the school district from focusing on what they should be focusing on and had traditionally been focusing on, educating their students, it's going to detract from that education and that ability to, have a functional school district.
And it's exhausting and demoralizing for teachers to have these attacks. And they can be just one parent saying, I don't like this lesson plan. I have instances of this reported to me in which a teacher says, a parent says, I don't like a lesson plan. And they go to the administrator, and the administrator then goes to the teacher. That kind of surveillance, that kind of interference is exhausting and demoralizing.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's actually the case with this, the situation with, are you there? You froze for a second. Okay. With the school board meetings in Johnston that I wrote about, that was the case. It was one parent objecting to two books, which I'd mentioned earlier already, the Sherman Alexi's Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian and Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give. And that's all it took, was one parent bringing this up, and then it became this whole issue. And they ultimately kept those books in the school system, I believe. But even just that becoming an issue and having to respond just to one parent, and that's part of the blueprint for this too. There are groups out there encouraging parents to file these complaints. And another thing is overloading public school, like public information officers with public record requests, and just doing things that are just totally frivolous, but that they sometimes have to by law, or are supposed to by law, respond to, like the records requests and things like that. They're very time consuming. And generally, exist for a good purpose, and are important for journalists and stuff like that. But there can potential for them to be abused is there, and so there's all these things that kind of chip away at, like I said, their ability to do with their actual jobs.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a complicated fabric or network of groups and PACs and parents and mama bears that there's a certain level of coordination, do you think, between and amongst them, that there are nodes of control? I think maybe like TPUSA crosses, Turning Point USA crosses my mind as an organization that seeks to keep the right stirred up. How do
Yeah,
you
well, TPUSA, I think it was in Johnston. They had that graduating student who was able to start a student chapter there, and uh, I don't have any of that information in front of me, but just it was quite a messy situation. And Turning Points USA, I mean, those people are involved with, like, they have connections to white nationalists, and which of course they deny. And it's very right wing, like far right politics that are part of this. And for all they Republicans will talk about not wanting to have certain ideas in the public school system because it's indoctrination. It's not their kind of indoctrination. They're okay if it's these other ideas that in their mind are okay. It's all, which obviously speaks to the importance of having allowing a range of ideas to be freely available and discussed in the education system. Um, but in
right?
terms of like, sorry, I was going
No,
to
please
speak to
go
what you
ahead.
asked about the networks. I mean, yeah, it's no like big conspiracy or anything. Obviously, I mean, you have the groups like I mentioned before, the PACs that are funding these national organizations that are funding these fights. Obviously, in Iowa, Governor Reynolds is a big proponent of school privatization. And she's made a big show of being really tuned into the kind of Trumpian national Republican politics. She's gone on Sean Hannity's show and different Fox News programs, while she and her press people often ignore uh, requests for comment from Iowa journalists. They've done a number of things to, like, there's a legislative, what is it? There's a traditionally like a start of the legislative session. They'll have the governor and different lawmakers available to speak about their agenda for the year, which they canceled this year. They restricted press access to the legislature. Um, a lot of things like that, which I think are quite troubling, and just kind of thumbing their nose at the press. And they have a super majority in the state. They control almost everything in the state. The only Democrat elected to a statewide office anymore now is Rob Sand in the state auditor's office, which has limited ability to. It's an important role, and could be a crucial role here, where they're creating the new governor, they're the education reform committee, to try to bypass the um, economic analysis of some of this voucher stuff they're trying to push through. But there's no real enforcement mechanism tied to this, and they control the AG's office now. And um, but I'm getting off track again. There's just so much to this. There's also informal, I think, networks in terms of just the media that voters who vote for these politicians consume. And I guess I kind of mentioned that with what Kim Reynolds, her choice of like going on Fox News and things like this. There's a whole network of these kind of misinformation outlets that have an alternative narrative, and it becomes very easy to say the mainstream press in Iowa, which I actually think in a lot of ways could be doing a lot more to hold some of these politicians' feet to the fire than they do. Not to be too critical of the media, because, but it's easy to say they're not telling you the truth. I'm getting my information from these other places. Or the Iowa Standard, you're probably familiar with, is a big one in Iowa that's pushing this stuff. So I think there's the formal and informal kind of networks that all kind of contribute to this. Um,
Right, and that's right. I think you're very right to. You're describing those networks, which, uh, and I've asked you, when we talked about an interview, I knew that you would be have these larger contexts in mind and how they work. I mean, some of the interviews that I've done with teachers, for example, focus on the ground level sorts of experiences they've been having and what led them in some cases to actually leave the profession because of the pressure put on them. But this exists within these wider contexts that we're talking about, in terms of mass media, in terms of legislative approaches in terms of denial of access to the press. All of that makes a difference. So I'm grateful for you calling attention to those larger forces. That's what I really like to hear from you. And so, yeah, as long as so, please keep coming forward with any other insights you have about these
Mhm.
larger networks and pressures and forces at work here. Okay. So you said that you said you visited, and I want you to talk, if you would please, a little bit more about Ankeny. You've also reported quite a bit on Ames, I think, as well, right?
Yeah, I used
Uh,
to live in Ames, so yeah, I could talk
mhm.
about that.
Right.
Um,
Go for it. Yeah, whichever comes to mind, Ames and or Ankeny, but probably both. As much detail as we can get.
okay, well, Ankeny was I didn't write about this. I don't think I should have, but it's I attended a couple meetings. One had something to do with the mask mandates, so not directly about education policy, but I think the pandemic is definitely a factor in all of this, and it's really polarized people, and it's led to more um, animosity toward unfounded, I think, animosity towards the public education system and administrators and stuff who are just trying to follow a sensible health policy in a very uncertain environment with this new pandemic. And they're, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with all of that. It's been, a couple of years now. We're still not out of it, but so there was an overflow room I went into this meeting. Couldn't get into the actual school board room itself, and they had a rotating uh, locations. This was at, I can't remember where, some administrative building in Ankeny, I think. And so I went into the overflow room, and they had the meetings streaming on the on the screen in there,
Monitor.
and then yeah, and I started taking some photos. So I was going there to try to focus on sort of the conspiracy angle with this kind of this QAnon influence. That because I think I said already, I grew up in Ankeny. I graduated there. I got a really good education. It's back before Ankeny had two schools or two high schools. So I graduated from Ankeny High School in 2005. Graduating class of 399. It's grown quite a bit since I graduated. I'm not sure what the class sizes are now, but also I never saw anything like this with just the this conspiracy kind of just takeover of the school board's time and discussion. But so I went into this room and was taking photos of some of the protest signs, and Kimberly Reeks, she ended up putting me on TikTok and calling me a puke stain and accusing me of being like she had like a save the children hashtag with it, which is associated with the QAnon pedophilia conspiracies, and acting like I had ulterior motives for taking pictures that just happened to have like children in a couple of them. It's a public meeting. It's well within my right to take these photos, and I was not going up to children and taking photos of them, but she was saying that's what I was doing. And Stacey Pierce, that the QAnon guy who flies the JFK Jr. flags and stuff, he actually walked over to me with a chair over his head, like a pro wrestler or something, like he was going to slam it on my head. And he sat down next to me and tried to intimidate me. He made a veiled threat against me as I was leaving, you don't know what I'm capable of. And he's made other threats. He even had a letter to the editor as published in the Iowa Standard that was later like stealth edited because it seemed like pretty much like a threat of violence against the school board. So that you have to take these things seriously. It's not just a waste of time and energy, and there's a major like hassle to deal with. It's also, I mean, there are numerous examples of where people get radicalized online. They bring a gun into like a school board meeting or something, and they kill people. It's like these people are, he certainly does not seem to be particularly stable. Um, so this is kind of on the fringe of what's going on here, but I did write one thing about this because Michael Busolo, he was a former Branstad policy advisor who was elected to the state house from Ankeny recently, and he um, there were a series of tweets that he had liked that were very supportive of conspiratorial ideas in terms of kind of the election fraud kind of stuff and some other things like that, pandemic related things probably. But he had posed in a photo or two with the QAnon moms or the mama bears, as did the governor previously. That got a lot of attention, some news coverage. Um, so it is, like I said, on the fringe, but it's also infecting, the mainstream, has been for quite a while now, the mainstream Republican party. And I think those are examples with Buslow and Reynolds and the Mama Bears, just their willingness to turn a blind eye to this, and because it's beneficial for them. I'd almost compare it to like Steve King, for instance. He was discarded by the party, but not because of his racist rhetoric. It's because J.D. Scholten almost defeated him in the 2018 election. So he was a liability. And also that became an opportunity to primary him and get him out of the picture because he was causing trouble for them. But they don't have, until have a situation like that, they don't seem to have any problem with associating themselves with these kind of people or ideas, which I think is pretty troubling. And
Yes,
that was kind of, sorry.
no, you please go on. I want to just take opportunities for follow up, but I want you to continue as long as you have something to say.
Oh no, what are you going to follow up with? I was going to kind of
Well,
wrap up my
I
thought
was
there.
going um, I was going to. You talked about these groups as fringe, and you as you rightfully stated that these fringe ideas are being absorbed into the less fringe-like elements of the Republican Party. I suppose you might say mainstream Republicans receptive to these ideas, but these fringe groups, such as the Mama Bears, and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about them if you have more to say about who they are and how they're organized.
Okay.
I I visited their website. I don't know if you've done that, but
Yep. Mm-hmm.
it gives strong gestures to Michael Flynn and to Christian nationalism, for
Yeah,
example.
I can talk about their connection with Michael Flynn for sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, all of that's valuable, I think. Um, but there they are at a school board meeting, and there they are threatening you, and there they are, I guess, with supporters or people who are sympathetic to their views. I mean, uh, could you flesh that out a little bit more, both in terms of what the Mama Bears represent in this incident that you talked about? Because that sounds like that's pretty kind of a threatening and again, controlling and sort of silencing set of maneuvers and moves that are at work here.
Yeah, well, specifically, it wasn't them who threatened me. Aside from, I guess, Kimberly Reeks accusing me or kind of implying that I was like doing something untoward involving children on social media.
Okay.
But it was Stacey Pierce who was explicitly, or yeah, pretty explicitly threatening me then. But also the Mama Bears, I don't think are together anymore because, are you familiar with that? Kimberly Reeks, she falsely accused Emily Peterson of, I can't remember. I should have looked this up. Like
An
abusing
affair with
her.
her husband. An affair with her husband, I think it was.
Yeah, and it involved like some allegation with um like a child abuse or something that, and she had filed a false police report and she got arrested. She got charged with something involving related to that. So they've had a falling out, but that's very common with these. I'm not sure if you or anyone who's listening is familiar with the QAnon Anonymous podcast. It's one of my favorite podcasts, which just is these three guys and some other people now too who have been covering the QAnon movement and just looking at all these conspiracies. And they're not like pro QAnon. They're analyzing it, and it's kind of cathartic just because they're able to find the humor in it, but also cover it very seriously. And so stuff like that is, I think, helpful. Like mentally, just when you're following this stuff, it's very draining because even just trying to write about it or being directly involved in it in whatever regard is Anyway, like they've talked a lot about how just there's like lots of backstabbing, and because a lot of this is it's like social media influencers with the social media aspect of it, and it's an easy grift too. I think it's just there's so much opportunity to glom onto these conspiracy theories or this misinformation, whether it be about the vaccines or the masking and the pandemic, or grooming, supposedly, and the trans ideology and all these other things they claim are taking over school districts and all this kind of stuff. Which I guess kind of ties into the Michael Flynn thing. The mama bears, one of them, I think Kimberly, her daughter had what was it? Some skin condition because of the mask, which is not. She has staph infection, which you cannot get staph infection just from wearing a mask. It's like you have that once you have that infection, if you don't clean your mask and you practice proper hygiene, it's going to exacerbate the problem. Or I think it was like recurring, flare ups of the infection or something. But she was claiming that masking was directly responsible for that. That's what he had a sign with her kid's face, picture of her kid's face on it. She started gaining traction with that, and she ended up going to a lot of these. They didn't call them QAnon conferences. A lot of these people who are involved in this, they deny they're part of it because they're self-aware to some extent about like the negative association with different labels like that. But Michael Flynn is quite. It's still kind of bizarre to me that all of this is bizarre, but there are these high-profile conferences with people like Mike Flynn, Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, who's became the big Trump election denier conspiracy guy. A whole bunch of people like that, and some more fringe people. Some of the people I think they might have the Mama Bears. They had their own podcast, or they were on maybe not their own podcast, but they went on some far right podcasts. They have clips of on that website you mentioned. But they started getting invited to these basically, like this nationwide tour of like QAnon conferences, and Mike Flynn they had like a personal connection with him, and he would introduce them at some of these, and they had a very close tie to him, which is strange since he was national security advisor, was it, from the Trump administration? It's a very high ranking official who just really went off I guess he was always maybe prone to that, or whether it's always hard to tell too, like how much of this is a grift and how much certain people truly believe in this. There's so much gray area there. But so these mama bears, they had national recognition, and then so anytime they pulled their antics in Ankeny, it was getting attention not only locally and from far right websites like Iowa Standard in Iowa, but also across the nation, and especially like within these far right kind of fringe conspiracy media networks, which I know cause even more problems for the school board. All the emails and stuff they're getting like, it's not just some angry parent in the Ankeny school district. It's some person saying, like, why the hell are you doing this from like, Florida or, Texas or wherever.
Yeah. Yeah. So all of these connections and all of these pressures and all these sources of pressures and the exhaustion of it all. Mm-hmm.
I can talk about Ames too if you want me to talk about that.
Yes, I do. I was just going to ask you to do so.
Let me pull this up. So, yeah, so this was the PAC. Well, going back further, I'm looking at this other article I wrote before so there's a school board election in Ames in 2017 where there were three challengers, these three women, Monique Benkin, Jemette Colton, and Gina Perez. They all ended up getting elected, and there was a lot of discussion about problems that had come up with issues of diversity. And I did not brush up on this, but there are some concerns with racial gaps in education and stuff like that I wanted to address. That became kind of a central topic in this election, and they'll.
and their politics were
They're all
what?
progressive candidates,
Okay, that's what I thought.
and yeah, so they all won election. I think that kind of precipitated some of this backlash with the article that I think you told me you looked at with the anti Black Lives Matter pact targeting the Ames school district. A closer look at is the title of this one. Yeah, and it's called Ames Deserves Better. There was Eve Leaderhouse. Let me see her name is. Yeah, Leaderhouse. She has been active in Ames for a long time, local business organizations. She was a spokesperson for the council members, Tim Garden, who I know personally. He's not a bad guy or anything, but he ran in 2010 for the state senate against Herman Kornbach, who's a guy who's been really on top of a lot of these education policy things and kind of running the numbers on that. Uh, but she went on Fox News and was talking about there was a Black Lives Matter week of action, I think, with curriculum in a school district, and they said a lot of stuff that was very misleading in terms of what children were being exposed to. The school district or a teacher, I can't remember who, but well, somebody, yeah, Ames School District acknowledged, they had, I'm just reading off my article here, but the longstanding struggle with addressing racial disparities in student achievement levels. It's a quote from the district. For years, our data has shown there's a need to focus on our Black students. For years, community groups have requested we improve the educational experiences of our Black students. For years, Ames Community School District staff have been working on deepening their critical consciousness. Now is the time for us to take action. And they had different. They had this. It was like age appropriate topics that they try to do. It's based on their grade levels. Not sure if this thing's still online or not, but for example, there was a book about a mermaid who was a boy, or like this boy who dreamed about being a mermaid or something. So like just like not traditional. Like, it is okay to not have adhere to traditional gender roles and just kind of things like that. They're pretty basic and really, I would say, should not be controversial. I think it's good to promote tolerance and promote, it's kind of like anti-bullying and things like that. It's like not everyone is the same. Not everyone has to like conform to these specific things. Of course, this is all viewed as or attacked as like being part of like this left-wing indoctrination in our schools. I think it's really out of hand, and this Ames Deserves Better political action committee really kind of capitalized on that opportunity to drive home that narrative. Thankfully, Ames is, despite being in the 4th district, that was represented by Steve King for a decade now, Randy Feenstrut's Ames and Story County is kind of like one of the liberal bastions, I guess. There's plenty of conservative thought throughout there too, but so these candidates that they were supporting did not win, but they caused a lot of issues with the school board. Who was it? Sorry. Let me check here. The superintendent who had recently been hired for the district stepped down, and it was not like officially because of all the politics with this, but it seemed to me certainly have played a direct role in her decision to, I believe Jenny Risner,
So
to
this
step
would be
down.
the politics of Republican influence, or I was going to use the word harassment, but that seems like a loaded term. Just their
Perhaps, but I mean,
intervention.
there's certainly harassment happening as part of this. I would say with the emails and stuff, various people were sending, not necessarily to the people who are in charge of this group, but there are people who got caught up in the fur of the
Mm-hmm.
politics of it. Where are you
So
going to ask it?
I was going to ask, as I recall, maybe from your articles, maybe from other sources, that there were some student walkouts over certain issues in Ames. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I don't know if I wrote about that or not, but yeah, it's similar to. Actually, I don't remember exactly what that was
Mm-hmm.
a
Well, there have been
response
student
to.
walkouts. I mean, you've also reported on the Denison, Iowa, the far western part of the state, where a teacher in school used the N word in a certain context, and that led to a student walkout. So I'm trying to think about at once
I think
sort of
in
the
Ames
dynamic.
is a
Yeah,
walkout probably in support of the LGBT students or in support of the BLM week of action. I think it was kind of like a show of solidarity, and this was something that happened around the state and the country too. I think at certain points, right?
I think so, and I guess I'm eager to document those and have them recognized and understood here in Iowa, in particular. This podcast being sort of centered on Iowa,
Yeah.
but yeah, but
Um,
Denison, I think you did report at least briefly on Denison. You know some things about that incident, if you can recall.
yeah, I could talk about that. But let me wrap up what I was going to say about Ames quick before I forget.
Oh, of course,
Because
by all means.
Eve Leaderhouse, she and her husband were kind of leading this Ames Deserves Better pack, and she was invited on Fox News, I believe she was, to talk about this. I think I mentioned that already, maybe. But so that again is like a local issue where, because of the nature of just the political environment, it gets way more attention than it otherwise would have, and it becomes this whole other beast where the school district now has to contend with this and with the national exposure and the national negative exposure, because you can tell how they're going to frame a thing like that on a channel like Fox News. um, there's one other thing. Oh yeah, so then also there was a state house committee. um, where is this? The week of action at Ames School District became part of this like state house probe by this Republican from Oskaloosa, whose name I'm blanking on, Holly Brink, Republican state representative. So that got even more attention on like a statewide level, because they were making all these, you know, assertions about what the Ames School District was or wasn't doing, and the appropriateness of it, and really politicizing something that was not intended to be a partisan political statement. It was meant to be, an inclusive, you know, educational experience for students, and they were able to opt out of it. That became another thing. Like, how easy was it for them to opt out of it and everything? But anyway, I just wanted to mention that for a little extra context. But the situation in Denison was so Stephen Holt. He is a very uh, right wing lawmaker, state representative from Denison, and he's a big, to this day, big supporter of Steve King. He's has expressed support for, and he's clear that he follows a lot of conspiratorial media sites and has similar racial views like Steve King. His wife is a high school government teacher at Denison High School, the community school district, and Crystal Holt. And I didn't put all the context because I probably wasn't aware of it at the time in the first article, but I mentioned it in another one. But anyway, like she was teaching a class talking about a death penalty case involving a black defendant, I believe, who was, I don't remember the exact case or if they ever mentioned what it was, but she claims that students were setting her up to use the N word because they're acting like they didn't know what she was referring to. What do you mean the N word? And they were secretly like filming her or something, which I imagine they were doing because she has a history of saying questionable things about race beforehand. It wasn't just like in a vacuum. They were just going to try to get her on this for no reason. Um, but the school district found there was no malicious intent, and she was, I think, briefly suspended, or there was an investigation, probably following their typical procedures. And there was that walkout protesting it, but she's still teaching there. And this is interesting too. Just like, even she's a public school teacher, supportive of Stephen Holt's supportive of a lot of these privatization, education reform proposals. I'm not sure exactly where he stands on everything, particularly with this new legislative session. I haven't followed up on all of that yet, but I looked through their social media, like their Twitter profiles and Facebook, and they are She was tweeting stuff that like really like racist kind of stuff, like about Ilhan Omar and um, like thugs in Baltimore. Like it's a picture of some black youths on top of a car, like rioting or something. And just like the implications are clear. You know, it's like there's these like racially problematic things to post. She had other videos on her Twitter of like black men downplaying, you know, like the Black Lives Matter movement or something, which is something that Republicans like to do. They like someone like Candace Owens, you know, this I mentioned her in one of these articles. Um, they say stuff that they repeat right wing arguments or like talking points that are um, kind of anti-black. I would say. I mean, they're not to overgeneralize on the other side, but you know, they act like, you know, this one black person, you know, opposes the Black Lives Matter movement or doesn't think that racism has been a problem in her life. So we're gonna, you know, use her as a voice for all Black Americans, kind of thing. And that's sort of the along the lines of what Crystal Holt was uh, putting on her social media profile or you know accounts. So for her to say that she was using the N word in context to explain the racism against this black man who may have been I think like unjustly prosecuted for like on like a death penalty case. Um, you know, I think that's it's questionable to use that word. Um, you know, anyway, you could have a discussion about when it might be appropriate to use that word as opposed to just the N word. You know, because everyone should know, I think, know what that means. But it does not help her case that you know she's posting all this stuff on the internet and then acting like you know she has you know no racial bias in what she's teaching, even if she was supportive of you know the idea that this was a botched case. You know, it's so that was part of the, you know, the walkout there, and it just shows how these views are. It's you know I would hate to have a high school government teacher like her who is openly posting conspiracy stuff. I think Stephen Holt actually had posted something from Jack Posobiec, who's a Pizzagate conspiracy theorist guy. If you're familiar with that, it's like the precursor to QAnon with the you know child sex tunnels, you know trafficking sex tunnels in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington D.C. that Hillary Clinton was supposedly involved in, and um, then another guy associated with the Alex Jones show, one of them, or if not both of them, had posted retweeted stuff from him. It's just like as a high school government teacher, you should have the wherewithal to understand this stuff is not appropriate or responsible to be disseminating. Unfortunately, that's pretty common. So that was kind of the Denison thing. Nothing came of it in terms of real consequences for her, but
Right. Uh, but I'm interested and intrigued with, for example, these students deciding to bait this teacher to record uh, this to recognize that there's a good chance she might speak in ways that would be offensive uh, and be white supremacist. I guess in the final analysis, that they would then take that opportunity. I'm interested in to put it cut to the chase, sort of resistance developments among students and maybe amongst teachers, but amongst students, they seem to be oftentimes taking the lead. One can argue these kinds of actions have long term consequences in terms of long resistance movement, long struggles. You know, these are the early phases of a resistance effort that can take stronger political formation, even though they seem to kind of dissolve into thin air, but they do make a difference. So I was just wanted to hear from you about if you have any thoughts about this kind of action.
yeah, I don't know exactly what happened. Unfortunately, I've done my I have a day job, and the Iowa Informer is a passion project I started out of grad school. That right now I'm evaluating whether to fix some of the issues with the website that I mentioned to you before we started recording, or I have a Substack thing I started. I might try to. I'm gonna keep writing. I just haven't decided uh, what avenue to go with that. And I've not been particularly active in the past year, as a result, partially as a result of that. Some other things going on in my life, but um, and I mentioned that because of just the time limitations and stuff. I was hoping to get in touch with some of those students involved in that to do a more in depth follow up, and I never managed to get around to it. So I don't know exactly what the case was there, but I do think there's a lot of students. I think it's pretty badass that students are, resisting this. I think it's important, and it's something that I never did in high school. And I mean, this stuff wasn't happening, and I generally enjoyed the education I got, but I kind of wish I was more of a rabble rouser, kind of looking back on that. But certainly with um, any of these cases that we've talked about earlier, like the Johnston with TPUSA, or the stuff with Brad Zahn and Jake Chapman, Ankeny School District, in all of these school board discussions and meetings, there's students are present at these meetings, and students who are speaking up in defense of LGBTQ peers if they aren't a part of that themselves, that community. And that's really great to see. I have a tendency to look at the kind of negative side of all this, and it's easy to be really cynical with just the current political situation of our state and the kind of struggles or lack of resistance from the Democratic Party institutionally. They're really neutered, or that's the best word, but they really don't have any political power right now, and I think there's
Sure.
a lot they need to reflect on themselves and figure out a better way to go about that within the system. But it is encouraging to see students at these meetings, in the classroom, with this example in Denison, um, pushing back against this stuff, and I think that will definitely continue. Have you followed some of the legislation that's already been proposed in this current legislative session? With there's like a version of the Florida "Don't Say Gay" bill.
And
Uh, there's another one that's even worse, where it's they're trying to make it um, require educators to out students, basically, if they come to them in confidence saying, "I'm struggling with my gender identity," things like that. So, I mean, this is serious stuff. I mean, like, you could, if they're forced to out a student, and their parents, they're coming to a trusted educator instead of their parents because their parents are not okay with that lifestyle. I mean, this leads to teen suicide. This leads to like a lot of depression. It certainly interferes with their ability to learn and be accepted and just feel comfortable and safe in an environment in which they should feel safe and comfortable in, and without, and have the support to deal with these issues without being, demonized or targeted politically by it. And I think that's just awful. It's really sad to see. So it is encouraging to see students. I know there's a lot of educators speaking out about this, former educators. You mentioned Nick Covington, you've been working with on your podcast project. I know him from high school. He was a grade ahead of me, and he's a great guy. So I'm encouraged to see him speaking out so forcefully about some of these issues.
yes, and I've recorded him in a podcast,
Okay.
so his story has been told there, and I think he's told it in your Iowa Informer columns at one time, hadn't he, or not?
Nick hasn't.
Greg Wickenkamp.
Yeah, Greg did.
Hmm.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? You had an education at Ankeny, and you said that, well, maybe you probably would have been a rabble rouser in the current situation, but perhaps in your history education, let's say, for example, um, I suspect you had at least some exposure to the history of African Americans. Um, you had some exposure to the issues involved in, let's say, Jim Crow laws, at least, the civil rights movement of resistance, student resistance, um, through sit downs and occupying soda fountains and so on and so forth. That you actually had that, and the teacher was not afraid of saying systemic racism because it's against the law to say so in an Iowa school. You didn't experience that, so maybe there didn't need to be student turbulence of that sort. But now those things cannot be said, and students are maybe chilled. Teachers who feel silenced and chilled and vulnerable uh, may well be reluctant to bring up these topics and address these subjects. And
Was an
so,
interesting. Sorry.
no, you go ahead, please.
Was yeah, I was also when I was in high school. I know I was a lot, more naive and blind to some of these issues and stuff too. And I'm definitely a lot more. I can look back on that, and obviously, like I'm 36 right now. I'm not going to be the same person I was when I was a teenager. But um, so I have a lot more um, knowledge of all this now, and I can look back on that and realize where I was unaware of some of these things. Uh, but yeah, I don't remember. I do remember I took AP government and history classes, which I believe is what Nick taught at Ankeny before he left. Um, U.S. government history was it? I can't remember which
I know
one,
I
but
taught Europe. I know I taught European history
oh,
and
That's right.
talked,
Yeah. So yeah, European
talked about
history was
white
in when I was a sophomore.
nationalism. Mhm. Go
Oh
ahead.
yeah, and he got talking about yeah. I mean, there was never. I don't remember exactly what was taught, but I would say certainly that we could have discussions about that without it becoming a big issue with parents, or if it was, it wouldn't rise to the level of it has now. I mean, part of that's like Donald Trump and comparisons of him to like being a fascist and things like that, where everything became politicized more harshly because of that. But I do remember my U.S. Government teacher was conservative, and he was friends with the U.S. government teacher. It says like my junior year and then senior year, I think, were those classes, and they kind of bantered about that, and it never became any issue where it was a problem. They had their views, and they were still teaching. I know there's of course plenty of criticisms you can make of the curriculum itself, and just like what those even like the AP books so they find it to teach. They gloss over certain aspects of history and focus more on others. But yeah, in terms of it becoming some big controversial issue, or students, or I mean parents, are trying to go to the school board and censor what's being taught, I don't remember that being a big issue. The one thing I remember was there's a religious parent in Ankeny who got like Playboy magazines banned from like the local gas stations. So there's little things like that. But that was nothing like you know suppressing the teaching of race relations in America or anything.
Right. Well, so in the 18 years since you graduated, I suppose. Yeah, we were in a very different historical moment. These developments are deeply embedded in American history, so they were working their way uh, through our contemporary situation, even back in 2005. But as you've delineated so very well, these are large political operations that are at work to create this current situation. It's not just accidental. It's highly organized, and in some ways highly disparate in its modes of influence and an attack, I suppose you might say, in some cases. So, yeah, I mean, we're near an hour. I'd like you to kind of, if you want, talk a little bit more about those developments, and if you have, and then we'll kind of wind it up. So you've been with me for an hour, and I appreciate it. So I don't want to keep you too long.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me to talk. I guess one thing that based on what you just said there is I think it is very instructive. We're talking about history classes, but even just understanding history of these kind of politics and moral panics and stuff. Like it's not entirely, certainly not entirely unprecedented what's happening now. And there were efforts when I was going through K through 12 with like the religious right, and efforts to um, privatize schools and have more like voucher programs and stuff like that. And a lot of those issues are the same as the issues now, where um, in private schools they don't have the same, that they can be more discriminatory. They can like LGBTQ students, for example, things like that. That was an issue then, issue now, and some of the just kind of the confluence of different factors now. I think they're on a like national level. Barack Obama being the first black president, the backlash to that, like Donald Trump coming in after him, campaigning, using the birther conspiracy theory, a racist conspiracy theory, delegitimizing Obama's place of birth and credentials, like eligibility for the presidency. There's all of that really exacerbated things now, and the pandemic certainly further complicated things. But it is instructive, I guess I'm trying to say, just to look back, and it can be very hard to find hope in some of the stuff like in Iowa, what's happening now. Um, but it's not all without precedent, and a lot of it is, I think, influenced by just the national trends and stuff. So hopefully there's a light at the end of the tunnel here. I guess I'm not sure what that will be, but
Well, you've joined the struggle, Gavin, with through your journalism, which is excellent, and your
thank
writing
you.
is superb. And I do hope you keep writing. And I respect the work you did with the Iowa Informer. I found it very intriguing and very interesting and very illuminating, and that's why I reached out to you. And you certainly helped me understand and listeners understand these how this is all working, how this is operating, both the efforts to control thought, control what can be discussed, to limit the nature of conversations inside schools, but also alluding to these places of resistance, both from students and from some parents and from some teachers. So, really appreciate you talking about this.
Yeah, appreciate you saying that about my work, and hopefully I was not too all over the place with my thoughts here. It's kind of hard to um,
Not at all.
summarize it all
This,
with all that's going on. But
yeah, nothing always has to be linear in its
yeah,
approach, and I thought we were pretty tight on our in our conversation. So
sounds good.
good talking with you, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, for sure. Good luck with the project, and glad you're doing this. So yeah, good to see you. I'll follow up and check out the website when it's up. And
Appreciate that. Thanks, Gavin.
yeah,
Take care. Have a good day.
yeah, you too.